A New York state legislator has introduced a bill in the New York Assembly that, if passed, would allow the governor to forcibly detain a person for up to 2 months without a court order if they're suspected of carrying or having come into contact with someone carrying an infectious and potentially deadly disease, like COVID. The bill allows for that person to be detained for up to 2 months without a court order and then in 3-month increments if the court signs off on it. All if the governor or one of his designated lackeys decides the person poses a health risk. This is an actual measure being discussed in the United States of America, where 15 days to slow the spread quickly became an effort to deprive you of your physical freedom if the government says you're a threat. Have you had enough yet? A new measure up for consideration in the New York State Assembly would allow for any person who contracts, may have contracted, or is simply suspected of having come into contact with a potentially deadly contagious disease to be forcibly detained at the governor's or his lackey's direction and held by the state in a facility for up to 2 months without a court order. Assembly Bill A-416, filed by Democrat Noah Nicholas Perry, would allow for any person carrying or even suspected of carrying a contagious deadly disease to be forcibly detained for up to 60 days in a facility that has been, quote, designated by the governor or his or her delegee during a public health emergency. If a court signs off on it later, that person can then be detained in recurring increments of up to 3 months each. Oh, but don't worry, the bill also says that person has to be released if the state determines they no longer pose a health threat, or if it turns out they were never actually sick in the first place. If this sounds like a tyrannical measure that's been used by dictators throughout history to forcibly detain people they don't like, well, that's because it is. See, if your brain is filled with gravel and you still don't get it after 9 months of this insanity, this is why people pushed back against mask mandates and curfews and shutdowns and the government telling them that they can't go to church because it might not be safe. Not just because these things are blatantly totalitarian and unconstitutional, and not just because the government has no explicit right to shut down all of society to protect you from a flu bug. And not only because these restrictions curtail the very freedoms and self-determination that this country was founded on, but also because this is what happens when you give the government an inch. They take 1,000 miles and every single one of your rights along with it. It never stops at masks or temporary shutdowns or, hey, maybe don't hang out in crowds for a couple weeks. It was never going to stop at that, which a lot of us were saying last March and getting called grandma killers for our trouble. We went from 15 days to slow the spread to we can forcibly shut down your business and deprive you of your livelihood to now discussing whether the state can literally abduct you without any due process if a governor's lackey thinks you might pose a risk to someone. This isn't a joke or a rumor or a long shot. This is an elected state official in New York who holds office and has a say in the laws that affect millions of people's lives, advocating for the right of the state to forcibly detain and effectively imprison you indefinitely, even if they think that you might be carrying a contagious disease but don't know it, or that you may have come into contact with someone who is. And if you think that can't happen here, consider that this is the same state legislature that has already determined that an unborn full-term baby can be legally murdered up to the day he or she is born. They applauded that and lit up the Empire State Building for it. Their open disregard for innocent human life is already well documented. What makes you think they give a rip about you? State and local governments from coast to coast have already decided that they can strip you of your right to worship freely, your right to patron certain stores, your right to open the business that you built with your own blood, sweat, tears, and money, and your right to earn a living and provide for your family. It is not a stretch from there to deciding they can lock you up arbitrarily for months if they think you might have an infectious case of the sniffles, or, if they just say you do. And to those who might asininely argue that this is an acceptable measure to take because it protects you from someone who might get you sick, consider that the same government that can forcibly detain someone else to supposedly protect you can do the same exact thing to you if they decide that you pose a risk they don't like. This is government and what it does. This is what happens when you allow it to balloon out of control and begin running your life. These are the same measures used by dictators the world over, all throughout history, to seize power and strip people of their freedom by preying on their fear. It's insidious and sneaky. It doesn't start with a bold takeover. It starts with a mask, with a request to stay indoors, with a promise to keep you safe. After all, we're only trying to protect you. And then it grows. And suddenly you realize you exist now at the government's whim, and it will never stop. Not until we make it stop. And that's your Reality Check, America. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube page, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and stay sane out there.